I'm Jasvinder Sanghera. Welcome to 3am Conversations. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
Normally, we ask our guests for 3 specific instances of what we've termed a 3am conversation, something that's kept you awake into the night. But looking at all that you've been through, we thought that might just be a little too difficult because you've struggled and you've fought authority and all that's gone with it for many years now. So we thought we'd try and look at 3 particular segments of your life and what was going on around those times. And so if we start with your childhood, and you ran away from home when you were 16, faced with the possibility of an arranged and forced marriage. Tell us a little bit about what led up to that and your early childhood years.
Yeah, so my parents are Indian, Sikh. My father came to the UK in the 50s, like many migrants, in search of work, and he settled in Derby. Mum joined him later on, and we were born in Britain. So I'm one of 7 sisters, and I have 1 brother. And I quickly realised from a very, very young age, I would say around the age of 6, that being a young girl, it was a very different life compared to my brother, first of all. And, you know, he was waited on, you know, even at that age, we were serving him food and, you know, we had chores. He didn't. Then as we got to the age of like 8, 9, I saw my first sister go off to India to marry this man in a photograph. And I remember her showing us this photograph. And off she went and disappeared and came back after almost, I don't know, it felt like a year. She was almost like a mother to us, the elder sister. And she came back and she was now married. And then it happened to another sister. But this time it was a sister who was in school with me. So then she was taken out of school. And then another sister. And I could see these sisters of mine at very young ages being taken out of the classroom, taken to India to marry men in photographs and then come back. And after Rabina, it was my turn because I could see we were being married in order of age. And I came home from school one day and my mother sat me down and she presented me with a photograph of the man that I was to learn at that point. I was promised to at the age of 8. And I remember looking at this photograph and thinking, he's shorter than me. He's older than me. I don't want to marry a stranger. I just want to go to school. And I dared to voice what I was thinking, bearing in mind, I'd never seen any of my sisters ever challenge my mother. None of them said no, is what I'm saying. So it was as if we were almost conditioned and groomed in a way just to go through with it. But I'd witnessed my sisters' marriages, very unhappy. And I thought, you get married off, you go, you get beaten up, and then they just leave you. That was my impression of marriage. And I said no. My mother was very clear. You know, you will not dishonour this family by saying no. You will marry him. And the photograph was put on the mantelpiece. The next day I went to school as normal. And you never dared tell anyone in school because from a very young age, we were taught to be silent. We understood that speaking outside the family was hugely shameful. So you would never risk telling anybody what was happening. So I wasn't going to tell a teacher or anyone. And then my parents could see that I became more obstructive, saying no, challenging them when I was 15 and a half. So they took me out of education and I was held a prisoner in the room. The padlock was on the outside of the door until I agreed to the marriage.
Right.
So as you saw your sisters being married, was there ever any family discussion?
I don't ever remember a family discussion other than the fact that, you know, you basically were told this is who you're marrying. And we were never allowed to look at a boy, let alone talk to a boy. And the concept of marriage and being allowed to think about a man in this way, I could see my sisters being quite excited about that. You know, and it was strange. So no, there was never a discussion other than, you know, what you would wear and where you're going and the arrangements. You'd never be told the date you were flying to India. And that was it, really.
So you were just watching it as an observer as you were growing, knowing that one day this question was going to fall on you.
But I have one sister younger than me. So it was somewhere in the distance. So I didn't think, I have sisters above me.
Would it have been possible for you to say no, to refuse the arranged marriage and stay at home and live with the family?
Absolutely not, because I did say no, and the consequences were that I was taken out of education at the age of 15 and a half. I never completed my GCSEs. I didn't read a book until I was 28 years old.
Yeah.
And, in the end, I said yes, purely to buy back my freedom to plan my escape. But even then, it was like having a bird's eye view looking down on all these preparations taking place of a wedding that happened to be mine. Almost felt like an out-of-body experience, actually. When I ran away from home, I ran away to make the point that I don't want to marry. So I remember ringing home because I wanted to go back home. And my mother was very clear. I could go home, but I would have to marry who they say. Otherwise, I was dead in their eyes. So the choice was, there was no choice. There was no, I couldn't go back. I wanted to go back home. I thought, this would teach them a lesson. They'll say, okay, look. But no, it was, you are dead from this day forward because of the shame. And my younger sister was forced to marry him because that's the only way they could reclaim the shame. The promise of a marriage is a huge thing in the family. And how are they going to hold their head up by not honouring this marriage? Well, they did it by forcing my sister to marry him.
And how did you wrestle with all the emotions you must have been going through?
Well, when I was locked in the room, I attempted to take my life by overdose. And because I just wanted them to hear and see me. I don't want this. I couldn't be any clearer. But they wouldn't allow me to have any medical attention. So I was just ploughed with coffee and walked up and down because obviously at that point, my family's probably thinking she's going to tell somebody at the hospital. And in terms of wrestling with the emotions, the biggest thing for me when I was at home and even when I left home was I always felt that I was doing this to my family and I was the perpetrator. I always felt like I'm shaming them, I've dishonoured them, I'm horrible. And this awful daughter who is treating her parents like that because they make you feel really guilty. So there was so much emotional blackmail. Dad will die of a heart attack. It'll be your fault. There's all this stuff. And I felt that I was the bad guy and I carried that right up until the age of 24. And when I left home at 16, the absence of family and missing them was immense. I always describe my life from the age of 16 to 19 when I had my first child as living a life with the curtains drawn. The depression, I became claustrophobic, I had agoraphobia, I was all sorts of things going on, the way my body was responding to the trauma of missing the family. So
even though you'd become physically free, emotionally free, not at all, really?
No, and I suppose even today, I'm still disowned by my family. I'm 60 in September this year. My family haven't spoken to me for over 43 years. So they've not only disowned me, they've disowned my children and my grandchildren. And so at significant times in my life, like the birth of my grandson, I still have family. My parents are no longer alive. If I go to my hometown and my family see me, they will physically cross the road and ignore me. So I've learned to deal with that in my life, being disowned. You cannot force somebody to love you as you would want them to, even if they're family. And I think sometimes as human beings, we make excuses for family because it's family. They can treat us less than we deserve. Well, actually, no. So I've learned to remove all expectations of my family. But there are some times when you feel that absence, some significant times. And my daughter's wedding was one. Natasha, she had the big fat Indian wedding and 300 guests. We had not one member of my family was there. You feel that because those are the times you share with family.
So we talk a lot on this podcast about 3 a.m. conversations and thinking back now to when you realised you could not go ahead with the forced marriage. Was there one moment where that really became clear to you?
Yeah, for me, it was when I wasn't allowed to go to school.
Right.
So, I became a risk in the family dynamic the risk was this marriage wasn't going to happen. So the way to deal with me was to take me out of education and lock me in a room. And I mean, food was brought to the door. It was like you were a prisoner. You know, in anybody else's terms, it would be, you know, false imprisonment.
Yeah.
You know, so then I knew it was real. You know, and there's nothing I can do. That was it. And it was only by agreeing to the marriage that I became the centre of attention, and I was like a wonderful child then, and I could have whatever I wanted to.
And that was a ruse, really, to buy time 100%. And buy opportunity.
Absolutely, that's when I.
How
left.
did you? You've talked about the years between 16 and 19, but how did you live? Because you were very young, and you made a life for yourself. But how did that work in practice?
Well, the thing about my childhood is that you were taught to be dependent, never independent. Independence is a threat. So as a young female, your sexuality is controlled. You are controlled, how you think, how you feel. I've never went to my hometown on my own. You know, it was always, it was a school. You'd be taken to school, brought back. You never had any freedom. Yeah. But neither did you have freedom of thought, albeit, nobody can imprison your mind. But the point is, when I left home, I was like a child in a sweet shop for the first time. All this independence and not having to look at my watch or think, what's mum going to think? I've got to get home. It was a very vulnerable place when you think about it in terms of no experience of life. But I ran away from home with my best friend's brother who helped me to run away from home. Yep. And he was 6 years older than me. And thankfully for me, he didn't take advantage of my vulnerability and helped me at that time. But to start with, we were sleeping on park benches. We were sleeping in the car. We were homeless. But I never expected to be with him. It wasn't Romeo and Juliet running away from home. I wanted to go back home. Yeah. But when I had no choice, I thought, well, this is a bed that I've made. I have to lie in it now. So
this is life.
I did. This is life. And so I ended up staying with him.
Yeah. Should we move on to the second segment then?
Yeah, sure.
And that's the work you've done around forced marriage.
Yeah.
And you were instrumental, I think, in two changes to the law, which we'll talk about. But what really gave you the impetus to start with that work? Where did it start? What was in your mind?
Well, for me, the impetus was absolutely my sister Rubina, without a doubt.
Tell us about Rubina, please.
Yeah, so Rubina was a year and a half older than me, and we went to school together. And she went missing from education, taken out of school to marry a stranger in a photograph when she was 15. She missed almost a year of her education. And when she came back, she was put back into my year at school, even though we had a huge age gap. And she was different. For a start, she was now somebody's wife. She had a wedding ring on her finger. She wasn't allowed to wear Western dress. But nobody ever asked where she'd been. Nobody questioned where she'd been.
Was her husband back in the UK?
No, they were always in India. And then the process of the family is you would sponsor that person into the UK. Right, that was the process. And anyway, she disappeared to, then become his wife because he couldn't get to England. He went to Germany. And she had a horrendous marriage. And in the end, she left him with a 6-week-old boy. And my parents allowed her to go back home. And they accepted that, she could be at home. But then later on in her life, she married for love. Now, I say marry for love because, we don't marry for love in our culture, the way I was raised. Yeah. And as I'll say, even in an arranged marriage, you're meant to grow to love somebody. The suitabilities or done all the ticks and whatever, and then they marry. The
timeline changes, doesn't
it?
Yeah,
but she married for love, and he was Indian, and same caste and standing, the whole thing. So my parents allowed the marriage, but they said if anything goes wrong in that marriage, you have to stay with him. So it was harder then if you make your choice. Yeah. The family, they treat you in a different way. But Rubina always spoke to me in secret, and that was a wonderful thing because I had a sister as a disowned person that used to talk to me in secret. So I would visit her in secret in Leicester. And I'd notice around her house there were holes in the walls. You could see cracks in mirrors and things. And it turned out that he was beating her up. And I spoke to her about this. One day I hugged her. She couldn't hug me back because she was so bruised around her ribs. And I said, look, come with me, I'll protect you. Come and stay with me. Because she said, it's easy for you to say because you don't have to think about izzat, which translates as honour. You don't have to think about what people think. You don't have to think about mum and dad. And she was absolutely right, because when I left home, I left all that behind me. You know, I'm now a free person that doesn't put that concept before my own life, before my own decision making. But she does. So she wouldn't leave because she was thinking, I can't do this to mum and dad and shame them, and plus it's a love marriage. So I begged her and go and talk to my parents, and she did, and they basically called the community leader to talk to her. Community leaders have huge influence in the community. They can be religious, they can be political leaders. Yeah. This person was a political counsellor. And he basically said to her, you need to go back and make your marriage work, otherwise it will kill your family. That he means kill the reputation of the family. And in my experience, I'd already witnessed this pattern of behaviour where my sisters would be beaten up by men. Mum would go and tell them why they had to stay there. She always had this saying where, think of a husband as a pan of milk. A pan of milk boils to the surface. Your role as a wife is to blow it on it and cool it down. That was her analogy that she would always give it. I remember it from very young. So Rubina went back home. I was a market trader in Leeds at the time, and this woman came to my stall and said, you need to ring home because something has happened to your sister. She wouldn't tell me what it was. I rang home, and bearing in mind, I've not spoken to my mum for all those years, you know. And my mother answered the phone, and I said, what's happened? And she said, it's Rubina. I said, what about Rubina? She said, she's died. She's dead. And I said, what do you mean dead? What do you mean? I'd seen her just a week ago, just came out, you know. We went to school together. What do you mean, dead? She said she set herself on fire and she committed suicide. And I said to my mum, I'm coming to the house now. And my mother said, no, this changes nothing. You don't come to the house. But I know you, and you'll come. So if you must come, you come when it's dark, when nobody can see your face. I remember thinking quite naively that for my mother to lose a daughter in such a horrific way, she's still treating me like this leper that is not allowed anywhere, not even to grieve. And it was in that moment that I finally owned the fact that you must not put your life on hold anymore waiting for these people to love you and to accept you. And I finally owned being a victim and not a perpetrator, because my sister's gone, you know, and you're still behaving in the way you are. And it was through Rubina's experience, we were sworn to secrecy, and I did go to the funeral. And it was hearing people say that it was better for my sister to take her life than for her to dishonour her family and leave an abusive man. And it was that made me think, I have to talk about this and speak about this. So I'm getting upset. So I decided to speak out, and it was my experience I started speaking out about in Rubina. But I didn't start speaking publicly until my parents passed away. There was something within me that felt, I can't do this to my mum and dad. That, you know, I don't want them to be portrayed as these horrible human beings, you know, because this happens because they were doing what they thought was best. I have a huge empathy for my parents today. I forgive them completely, you know, but it wouldn't happen without them thinking they needed that acceptance from the family, from the community. It gets bigger and bigger. These people didn't give them permission to think differently, is what I'm saying. So Carmen Ivano was born out of Rubina's experience and mine in 1993.
Right. Can I just ask you about the death of your mum and dad?
Yeah.
Because reading your book, I got the impression And there were two examples you give in the book. Your mother says, as she's dying, Rabina, I'm coming to you.
Yeah.
And your father puts your graduation certificate on the wall. Had they relented in any way openly by that stage?
My parents never showed me any sort of remorse or regrets of any kind. But I do believe they did it silently. You know, I saw them in secret again on their terms, and that was enough for me. You know, I was seeing them, but they could never see me in full view of the family because the family would have stopped talking to them, you know. So, but that's okay. But like you say, when my father passed away, you know, I was the only daughter to graduate at university. So I invited him to the graduation, but he couldn't do that. And then when he died, he made me an executor of his will, you know, not even his son. So he spoke 1,000 words in his death that he couldn't do publicly to put me in charge. And then for me to have the keys to the house I grew up in, actually, and to walk through his house. And then, you know, in the corner of the bedroom in a frame was my graduation picture. But he couldn't say that publicly because he would have been shunned.
You get a sense there that it's almost the power that they were all up against and the power that constrained them.
Yeah.
But making you the executor was almost the closest he could get to making his own freedom, really, from... I mean, it must have been so hard for them, I mean, as well, to be trapped and to have to disown their daughter in that way.
Yeah.
But maybe there was something there, and that all those things combined led you to set up the charity.
Yeah.
And set up you did in your front room to start with. So how did it get traction? How did you manage to build it into the institution, dare I say it?
Bloody mindedness, I would say. Not taking no for an answer. I in fact, people's views, and I say people, I'm talking about everywhere I knocked on doors. You know, it would be the police, it would be the local authority, it would be councillors everywhere, government, and them all saying to me, this doesn't happen in the UK. Show us the statistics, Jasvinder. And I would say, I am a statistic, so is my sister Rabina. And then I'd tell the story. And slowly I learnt to not walk into doors, but walk around them, you know, because I realised this was also about people's awareness. This whole experience of forced marriage, child marriage, honour abuse was cloaked in people's misunderstanding that it was a culture. It was part of people's tradition. It was part of their religion. So I had to kind of dismantle that to get people to see the human side of this. Look, I was born in Britain. I wanted to go to school like anybody else. When I went missing, nobody asked where I was. You know, why?
Did it start off, Jasvinder, as an awareness campaign?
Yeah.
Almost? You weren't thinking you're going to change the law in X years?
No, I wasn't. No.
What were you thinking, though? And what was your initial, right, I'm going to set this up and I'm going to do...
My initial thinking really was I wanted people to know this happened to my sister Rabina. I wanted people to know that she existed and her death mustn't be in vain. And I wanted people to know that there were more people out there just like her, just like me. I always believed there were. So, you know, I did things like I trained myself to be a Keep Fit instructor so that I could go and teach Keep Fit in the Indian Community Centre, the Pakistani Community Centre, which I did. And slowly over time, I used to get so many women, up to 50 women coming, all from that community. And at the end, I'd say, I've set up a health project for women. I'd never said what it was. And then slowly I'd say things like, you know, we're here to talk about PMT, breast cancer awareness and whatever. So when they started to come slowly to the groups, then I started to tell them about my story and Rabina's. Then they slowly started to open up about domestic abuse. And it sort of evolved. The very first women's health day I did in Derby was in 1998. You know, we had around 200 women there. But behind it, that was almost my disguise in order to talk about the real issues affecting the lives of these women from the South Asian community.
Wow.
You say bloody mindedness.
Yeah.
There must have been times when you thought, I can't do this. This is too great a mountain to climb. How did you cope with that feeling?
Well, absolutely. Always. I mean, I remember the first 7 years there was no funding.
No.
You know,
No.
and I have my children, and I'm a single parent, and I'm raising them as well, and I'm
And you're
doing
at
this, and
university
doing
at the
that,
time
and at
as well,
university
yeah,
in my
yeah.
final year, pregnant. Yeah, you know, the sense of giving up is always something that is with you, but it wasn't enough. I felt like it's almost missionary. It's like I felt impassioned to anybody that would listen. You know, people got to the point saying that you've been jazzed. You know, when I talk about this issue, I come to life and like just talk about it. But you're right, there are those days. However, you know, the charity was enabled by like-minded people. You know, volunteers that thought like me, that wanted to help, and I grabbed them. You know, just grabbed them and yes, please. You know, one volunteer, two volunteers, and slowly, you know, it spreads like wildflowers. You know, you basically get people to feel this. You know, people have to be moved. You know, it was never about funding. I never talked about the money. The money would find you. But if you could move somebody with what you were feeling, then you could move them into action as well. And slowly I started to do more and more of, and getting louder in my voice and stronger, praying for platforms. I mean, I remember, you know, saying there was an event. If 2 people came, I was deeply grateful, you know, and then slowly you've gone from 2 and then 10 people would come. You think, wow, 10 people. And then you keep on doing it. And now thousands come.
And would you draw strength from listening to other people's stories?
You know, I never met a person that was a survivor of a forced marriage, ever, like me. It was only, I remember when I set up the helpline in my front room in 1993, you know, it never rang because the helpline was only going to ring if you raise awareness about its existence. And, you know, in 96, we'd probably get about 3 calls a month. And I had a couple of volunteers and they would say, but Jasvinder, the phone never rings. And I said, if you don't believe it's ring and they're not out there, you're in the wrong place. They are out there. They just don't know we're here. So we've got to do more work for it anyway. It was only over time that the awareness grew. Then I started to meet women like me who were survivors. And that was just amazing because, you know, it's that beginning of 93 thinking, I have to do this because I know there are people out there just like me. And then when you meet one and then you meet another, it's just, it validates your experience. You know, it reminds you that, you know, you haven't done anything to your family. You know, this is wrong. You have the right to survive without being abused by your family. And now, you know, so many of them speak now publicly, which is, you know, I developed the Survivor Ambassador program, got more and more people to speak. And now we get thousands, don't we, speaking, which is amazing because it's really important that victims out there hear people like me and others. They've got to believe, because if you're disowned by everything you've ever known, how on earth do you start your life? I say I was orphaned at 16. That's how I see it. You know, I read on Facebook at Christmas that my brother had passed away. I'm not told of deaths or births. You know, this is the reality of estrangement. This is something. But then I look at my children and they have independence, freedom, the right to choose because of the decision their mother made when she was 16. And I always feel very strongly about that message because I wasn't thinking that at 16. I can look now at them and know they're free because of choices I made. And this is what we have to get these young people to see.
In terms of awareness, in 2007, I think it was, you brought out your first book,
Yeah.
Shame, which must have caused you some sleepless nights, some uneasy 3 a.m. conversations.
Absolutely, because one of the things about the book is, you know, it's a memoir. You know, it's my story. So, and I was very honest. I tried to be as honest as I could in that book. So it's almost like, you know, washing your dirty linen in public. It's all out there, you know. So even to the point where, you know, when I was 21, I didn't deny the fact that, you know, here I was. I never had an alcoholic drink until I was about 22. And then I didn't have the experience of life in the world. And I got thrown into staying with the guy and I married him and whatever. And I had an affair. And I was very honest in the book about that because I wanted people to understand what vulnerability does. You know, how you can attract behaviours. You know, the addiction of taking tablets and whatever I did. I wanted to be really honest, but I didn't know how people would take that.
Mm-hmm.
But equally, I want people to recognise that vulnerability is a gift in the hands of a person you choose to trust. But equally, with vulnerability, things can happen in your life that are not great. But that's because it's where you are. So from my perspective, it was, I don't know how people are going to receive this, you know. And, you know, it was that feeling of, you know, and everybody has that feeling, is anybody going to read it?
Yeah.
You know. So, yeah, there's a mixture of emotions. And, you know, I never named my children. You know, I always was careful about their feelings. But, you know, I did talk about past relationships and things. So, yeah, I suppose it was a sense of, you know, anxiety of how it's going to be received, if it would be received well or if it's going to make things worse. Members of my family are still alive. All those things were going through my head. And, you know, thankfully it was received well. Not by my family. I wasn't received well at all.
So the anxiety that the prospect of bringing the book caused you, how did you deal with that?
Well, the first thing, the way I dealt with this was before you publish it, you know, you have a manuscript, you have a draft, and I shared it with the people I absolutely trust. So friends have become my family in my life, and there's 2 people I would trust with my life. And I got Trish, my best friend, to read it, and she read it, and to get that opinion, to get that view, to get that perspective, and also to do the risk assessment. So that helped me. And then also to frame it back in that space of, look, you have become this person that is speaking out against these things. This is part of that. So you have to validate yourself and remind yourself of why you're doing it. This is going to make the campaign even stronger. So, you know, you take yourself back to coming back to that place as well. And that's what you remind yourself of. What I never expected was for it to do so well. And also death threats. I had death threats, you know, from that very community. And that's when I had to really learn how to take risks seriously in terms of that sort of thing. I mean, I know how to look for bombs under my car. I was taught to do that because I had a bomb threat. So, yeah. And then the more people read the book, the more I became less of a threat because more people were talking about it, if that makes sense. So that always made me feel safer.
It's not just you anymore, is it? It's
exactly.
a community. Yeah.
And it made me feel so much safer. I remember my editor calling me and saying, "How does it feel, Miss Bestseller?" And I went, "What?" He said, "Yeah, you're number 5 in the bestsellers list." And the first thing I said was, "Wow, imagine how many people are reading about this issue and how that's going to impact on the reporting."
Yeah.
And he went, "What? Just stop a minute. Can you just hear what I said and just own that for a minute?" And I went, "Oh, no, forget that." I said, "Can you imagine what's going to happen now?"
Let's move on then to the future. Because, you know, you walked away from Common Nirvana 2018.
Yeah.
You've hardly sat on your hands. Because over the last 5 or 6 years longer, you've taken on the Church of England. You were on the Independent Advisory Board. You've taken on Harrods, or you're taking on Harrods at the moment, and the victims of Mohammed Al-Fayed. You're now campaigning for us grandparents and grandchildren where there are separation issues.
Yeah, definitely.
Why?
I'm driven by injustice. It's as simple as that for me. And very often injustices, people find me and, you know, people move me. I'm here. You know, my mother used to say to me, "You were the only one born in a hospital. You were the only one born upside down." You know, I was different from birth and difficult from birth, should I say. What drives me is injustice. I want to be part of making sure that we live in a society where you hear the people that actually don't get a platform, the more vulnerable in society.
Yeah.
You know, so, and also very often it's when you have a personal experience of something, grandparents being one, you know, when you feel something and it's been an injustice to you, I start searching for others like me.
Right. Yeah.
And then that took me into that space of when I was estranged from my own grandson, one of them, meeting all these other grandparents in the same space. And I'm thinking, we need to do something about this, and know what I know. And the fact that I believe that when you are recognised, even publicly, or recently I was knighted, I have a greater responsibility to use that to raise the profile of these causes that we're not hearing about. 'Cause that's what they're there for,
Yeah.
So for me, it is that sense of I believe that I can make a contribution, and I'm going to use what I know and the people and the links and the platforms to help those causes that don't get a light shone on them. Yeah. The thing is, I suppose, what drives me is I'm not here to be liked. I will raise my head above the parapet. I'm not afraid to do that. And I've learnt from, I suppose, my own self in terms of resilience. I've learnt that, you have to be true to yourself. And, even if it means taking a risk, and I can home in on those skills of being that 16-year-old, being homeless, and coming out of that. Now, if I can do that, I can do this. I don't care if you're the Prime Minister. You've got a job to do. So when the Labour Party didn't criminalise forced marriage, I went to the opposition. That's what I did with David Cameron. If you come into if you're the PM, will you make it a criminal offence? Yes, I will, Jasvinder. I was there with all these survivors. Can you say that publicly? Yes, Jasvinder. He did. Then as soon as we went to number 10, I was knocking on that door. You said, and I'm not embarrassed to publicly.
Because you went back in 2022 and saw the then incumbent, didn't you, Mr. Sunak?
Indeed.
On grandparents.
Well, absolutely, I did. Yeah, and the grandparents campaign is still going ahead, and it's important that it's horrendous.
Could you just explain that? What the campaign is driving to there?
Yeah, sure. So there are over 2.4 million grandparents in the UK whose children have stopped them from seeing their grandchildren. Yep. Just like that. And these are safe, loving relationships. But as we know, in families, you can have disagreements. And what the parents have done is use the children as a weapon to say, you're not going to see your grandchildren anymore. So, 2.4 million. And I will say that I was one of them. And I started the pain of that loss. It's not a loss I don't know because I'm disowned by my family. But when it's your own children's children, and legacy is so important to me. I don't want my children or grandchildren to inherit a legacy of abuse. So I made it my business to look at the law. What does the law say on this? Where do we stand if you've got a daughter who's not willing to engage with you on this? The law's not great on this, actually. And so then I started to look for grandparent support groups, and there's so many out there. And in my time of doing this, which is for the last 5 years, I have been aware of the suicide of 5 grandparents. It is horrendous what they go through. The missing, they're going through a long court process. So what we need a law like France that recognises...
And Ireland, I think, as well.
Yeah, Ireland are working hard on this too. That Israel.
Yes.
that they recognise grandparents as having the right to see their grandchildren, as long as they're loving, safe relationships. We don't have that here in the UK. Look, grown-ups fall out, but children should not have to suffer, is what we're saying. So from my perspective, I've, really pushed it. Yeah, I met with Rishi Sunak. I've done a grandparents report. I've met with Sir Andrew McFarlane to have a conversation, the president of the family court. But again, that goes back to who I am and what I have in my gift of campaigning and the links I've made, which these grandparents are deeply grateful for. And then you need people to shine a light on it. These great big charities you have that have got loads of money, and then you've got people on the ground that have got hardly anything, and their campaign isn't as important. They're the ones that we need to hear. So
A voice for the voiceless, as you put
well,
it.
yeah, and that's what I want to do. So that's Grandparents Campaign.
So when you look back at 16-year-old
Yeah.
Jasvinder,
Yeah.
are you at peace now? Do you feel just loads of pride? Are you only just beginning? Is it a combination of all three? How do you feel now about?
I'm going to tag on a final point to Anjon's, because on your website,
Yeah.
there's a gallery page, of course, as you know, with photographs
Yeah.
and what have you.
Oh,
And
yeah,
on the
that you
last
click on.
photograph, if you click on it, the epigram underneath is "the best is yet to come."
Yeah.
So, go on.
Well, I'll answer your question first about the peace. I feel absolute peace when it comes to my family now. I have learnt to live a life without a family that disowned me and my children and my grandchildren. And I'll be quite frank with you that in my will, I've made it quite clear that they're not to come to my funeral. Because if they couldn't love me and my children when I was alive, I am taking control back and not giving them the opportunity to show their face for saying that they showed their face. Because I've been raised within a family dynamic where you have to live for other people, what other people think, and show your face. And you're not doing that to me or my children. So I've put that down. I've got that peace. I feel proud of the fact that I have made a contribution to a space that nobody was talking about back in 1993. Self-pride is a very difficult one, because I sometimes feel that I can still hear my mother's voice, and, you know, it's difficult to receive the achievements. And maybe that's just me. I'm just being honest, you know. Natasha would say, Mum, drop the humility. Just own this for now. In terms of the best is yet to come, well, you know, I've got grandchildren. I get to see another generation that is not going to be the way it was with me and my family. You know, I still want to make a contribution. I want to make changes and create laws. That's where I am.
One last question I ask all my guests.
Yeah.
And that is, if there's ever a budget large enough to make a film that would encompass all of your life, and there are very many things that you have done, who would play you?
Gosh, that is a really big question, and I'm actually exploring a film.
Okay.
I'm writing my fourth book at the moment, but I am exploring a film. Do you know, I'd love my daughter to play me.
Excellent answer.
And you do get a double take when you see us together as well, so...
Right, okay. Well, when you do that, you come back and tell us all about it.
Thank you.
Dame Jasvinder, thank you so much for coming in
thank
today, for your honesty, for the way you've put across the fantastic things that you've done against a backdrop that, quite frankly, is horrific, isn't it, at the start of your life, and for the lives of many other people still. But to hear you talk about it really is inspiring, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.